Okay, hello everyone. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Stiles. I'm an ecologist and botanist. And today we're going to be delving into the wonderful world of ferns in this introductory course to fern identification. So I hope you're all very excited, because I certainly am. Okay, so let's get into it. Oops, Daisy. Great. So ferns, they are an incredibly diverse group with 17 families represented across Britain and Ireland. Now, only about 13 of those families are native to Britain and Ireland, but still a very diverse group. And whilst ferns are very diverse, in Britain we have just over 50 species. Now that it might seem a little bit daunting, but when we compare it to the over 1,500 other native flowering plant species, having just over 50 ferns doesn't seem that daunting anymore, I would hope. And whilst some people may associate ferns with woodlands and walls, they are in fact adapted to an incredible array of different habitats, from sea cliffs to woodlands to species-rich fens. And so they're incredibly diverse, essentially, in Britain. And although we have just over 50 native species, we also have 2 new species that are thought to be native, which includes this wonderful Nordic moonwort, Botricium nordicum, which has recently been separated from just plain old moonwort, Botricium lunaria. And we also have something else that's recently been added to the British and Irish flora, which is this fern it's the right hand picture, which is in the Polypody family, Stenogrammatis myosuroides, this picture from Rory Hodd. So yeah, we have just over 50 species, including 2 new ferns to Britain and Ireland. In terms of their evolution, ferns are prehistoric organisms. They are some of the earliest land plants. And they were first recorded in the fossil record during the mid-Devonian, about 390 million years ago. That's when they were first recorded. And in terms of their diversification, they radiated during the Cretaceous, about 145 million years ago, which is when most modern-day families emerged. And in the bottom right is one of our very earliest recorded ferns, Picopterus species from the late Devonian. So yeah, very prehistoric group, as well as being quite diverse. In terms of their life history, ferns are really interesting and very different to most they're very different to flowering plants. Essentially, it goes like this. The parent, the sporophyte, releases spores which germinate into gametophytes. And gametophytes, for most species, not always, but the gametophytes are usually haploid, so they contain half the number of chromosomes when compared to the sporophyte. And on gametophytes, they have sexual bits known as archegonium, which have the eggs, and antheridium, which release the sperms. And as soon as a gametophyte with antheridium receives sperm, they are able to produce a small sporophyte, which grows to the parent, and the life cycle goes on. And most ferns that you will be familiar with are indeed the sporophytes. And so I say this is an introductory course to fern identification. Really, we're going to be concentrating on those sporophytes, the big stuff that releases the spores. Okay. So as well as being diverse and prehistoric and just really interesting all round, ferns in Britain also have conservation interest associated with them. 5 species receive full protection across Britain and Ireland from picking, uprooting or destruction and sale. We also have in England 3 priority species of conservation importance, recognised as such under Section 41 of the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006. We also have a number of red listed species. So just pictured on the right hand side is a plant called crested buckler fern, which is IUCN critically endangered. And so we have in Britain a number of fern species, some of which have conservation interest associated with them. But also we have one invasive plant species, which I'll be talking about in a little bit of detail later on. Okay. So although we have a number of fern species, they're really interesting, they're prehistoric, and some have conservation interest associated with them, there is one common identification problem that people seem to have with ferns, and that relates to superficial similarity. Many species are superficially similar, and some people just don't know where to start with them, which is why I'm running this course. Okie dokie. So because of that problem with superficial similarity between some species, I've set a number of objectives that I want everyone to be able to do upon the completion of this course. Let me just check that. Great. And the first objective is that I want everybody to be able to be aware of key identification features that ferns possess that will ultimately assist you in identification to species level. So I want you to be aware of those key identification features is the first thing. The second thing I want everyone to be able to do is to have a basic understanding of the main fern families that we get here in Britain. So that is the second objective, and I'll be going over some of those main families momentarily. And the last objective is I want you to be able to differentiate after you've got to family. I want you to be able to differentiate between some of the common species that we get here in Britain. So those are the 3 learning objectives. What resources do you need to be able to identify ferns in the future? Well, growing up in my mid to late teens, I found photographic and illustrated guides super useful. The Big Black Collins book, pictured in the top right, is still one of my favourite plant guides, and I found it incredibly helpful when it comes to fern identification as well. If you want something a little less simplistic, then I would suggest going for something like the FSC Fern Guide, which has some lovely illustrated keys in it, although not quite as colourful as the Collins Wildflower Guide. If you want something a little more hardcore still, and altogether more comprehensive, then I would suggest the New Flora of the British Isles by State, which is a very, very comprehensive guide indeed. And of course, one thing that will be very beneficial, as with many other vascular plant groups, is to have a hand lens so that you can get up close and personal with all the bits that you need to look at. And so those are the resources that you would ideally have when it comes to fern identification. Okay. So let's get on to some of those key identification features that we talked about in the very first objective. So one of the first things that strikes me when I see a fern is its growth form or habit. So we can have ferns like this pillwort in the bottom left that are rhizomatous and patch forming. They have a long trailing rhizome that enables the plants to form patches. Alternatively, we could be looking at a fern that is tufted, like this scaly male fern in the right, on the right hand side. Oftentimes tufted ferns will be referred to as looking like shuttlecocks, because that's what they look like. So yes, we could have a fern that is patch forming and rhizomatous, or we could be looking at a fern that looks like a shuttlecock. And so growth form can be quite an important feature for ascertaining what we're looking at. That's the first identification feature that you need to be aware of. The second are the reproductive bits. It's all about the reproductive bits. And when we're looking at ferns, the arrangement and shape of sori, which is illustrated really well in this extract from the Fern Guide, the FSC Fern Guide. The arrangement and shape of these reproductive bits can be very, very important for identification, and they can differ significantly dependent upon the species or family that we're looking at. And so you need to be aware of the reproductive bits. And of course, one of the most striking and obvious things that we see when we look at ferns are obviously the fronds. And so when we look at a frond, it's very important to know how divided it is, what the shape is like. And so if we look at the first picture on the very left-hand side of the screen, this is a hart's tongue fern. It looks like a tongue, and it's not divided at all. And so we would describe the fronds of hart's tongue fern as entire. By comparison, the fern to the next right is a polypody. And a polypody frond is divided once into little segments here, which you can see my mouse hovering over. And so we would describe the growth form, the frond of a polypody as pinnate. Now this is where it gets a bit more complex. If we go one step to the right on this male fern, we would describe this frond as 2 times pinnate. And that's because it's not divided one time, but it's divided twice. And so the divisions, which you can see my mouse hovering over now, are divided into subdivisions. And so we would describe this frond as 2 times pinnate. Okay. And if we go one step to the right again, this is a buckler fern. And this frond is 3 times pinnate. So it's not divided one time, it's not divided 2 times, but it's divided 3 times. And so we have divisions of a division of a division. And we would describe this growth form as 3 times pinnate. Now don't worry too much, because I'll be going over that a little more in the next slide just now. Okay. So if we take a look at this pinnate polypody, each individual division is referred to as a pinna, or the plural is pinnae. By comparison, this zoomed in picture of the male fern, which is 2 times pinnate, it has the pinna, the first division, but the pinnae are divided into little subdivisions. And those subdivisions are called pinnules. And so it's divided not once, but twice, if that makes sense. I hope it does. And going on to a zoomed in picture of this buckler fern that is 3 times pinnate, it's divided into pinnae. And if we look at this pinna here, we can see the divisions of the pinna, the pinnules. And the pinnules are divided further into little bits called pinnulets, these really teeny weeny bits here. I hope I've described that well enough and showed you the appropriate bits well enough on these pictures. Please be reassured that this is the most complex it gets throughout the whole course. And I'd be happy to go over how divided fronds are in the questions later on. So yes, key identification features. We've looked at the reproductive bits, we've looked at the growth form, and we've looked at how divided the fronds are. I just want to go over one more key identification feature before we go onto the main families. And that key identification feature includes the scales. Now, many ferns, either on the rhizome or on the leaf stalk, the stalk of the frond, ferns can often have little scaly bits called scales. And if we compare this species on the left, the narrow buckler, to the broad buckler, the scales you can see here are very different. And so for narrow buckler fern, we have straw-coloured concolorous scales. By comparison, on the right, the broad buckler has a very, very dark brown centre and light-coloured margins to its scales. And so scales that ferns have, it's a feature that you need to be aware of, because some species have different scales to other species that might be closely related. So that's the last key identification feature I want to tell you about today. Let's take a look now at some of the main fern families. Hopefully that information on those key identification features has sunk in. Let me know in the chat if you like. Okay, so the first family that we're going to be looking at are the wonderful adder's tongue ferns, the Ophioglossacea family. Okay, so the adder's tongues are rhizomatous, so they form patches and they don't have scales. The leaves are borne singly from the rhizome. If we look at these two pictures of the adder's tongue and the moonwort, these are individual leaves. Okay, so they're rhizomatous and the leaves are borne singly. One thing that's quite characteristic about the adder's tongue ferns is that the leaf is divided into both a sterile and a fertile blade. If we take a look at these pictures, let's have a look at the moonwort on the right. So this green flat bit, that is the sterile blade. By comparison, this erect bit that looks like a punnet of grapes, that's the fertile blade. That's the bit that releases all the spores. And moonworts are actually, across parts of the world, otherwise known as the grape ferns, because the fertile blade looks like a punnet of grapes. By comparison, this adder's tongue has this flat, plain, sterile green bit, and the fertile blade is the bit that looks like a snake's tongue, hence the name adder's tongue, and that is the bit that releases all the spores. And moonwort and adder's tongue are often indicators of very good quality habitats, particularly grasslands. There are 5 species in Britain, but the commonest is adder's tongue, Ophioglossum vulgatum, and moonwort, Botrychium lunaria. So how do you tell the difference between those two common species? Well, it's quite simple, really. It's all about the sterile blade. In adder's tongue, it's entire, whilst in moonwort, if you remember, we were talking about how divided leaves are. We would describe this as pinnate. Quite simple, really. So those are the adder's tongues. Now we'll go on to my favourite family, the filmy ferns, Hymenophyllaceae. These plants are rhizomatous, just like the adder's tongues. However, unlike the adder's tongue family, the filmy ferns produce fronds that are 1 cell thick or thereabouts, and so they are very thin and translucent, which hopefully you can see in these pictures here. If you put your finger to the other side, on the other side of a frond, you should be able to see straight through it. They're fantastic plants. And these plants, there are 3 species native to Britain. They're typical of shaded, damp rock faces and tree trunks. With plants like Killarney fern, you'll often find them under waterfalls or near waterfalls. As I said, there are 3 native species, which includes Killarney fern, pictured on the left here. Now, sadly, because of historical declines, a lot of that decline was related to fern collectors. The Killarney fern is now a protected species throughout Europe. It's a European protected species. Okay, so those are the filmy ferns, rhizomatous plants with fronds that are 1 cell thick or thereabouts. On to the next family. Now, I said I'd talk about our one invasive fern species, and sadly, this is it. It is water fern, Azolla folliculoides. Now, it's quite a pretty thing, as you can see from this picture here. However, it's quite devastating when it gets into freshwater ecosystems in Britain and other countries around the world as well. Essentially, what it does is it's a floating aquatic. It's superficially similar to duckweed at a distance. And what it does is it covers the water surface in a dense carpet, which effectively eliminates everything. It's a pretty plant, but it's also devastating here in Britain. And plants are able to spread vegetatively, so essentially the frond keeps growing and growing and growing and then splits off and continues to grow vegetatively. And also water fern reproduces by spores, so it can spread vegetatively and by spores as well. So that's water fern, our one invasive fern species. On to the next family, hopefully something most of you will be familiar with, and that is the bracken family, which includes one species native to Britain, and that is bracken. Simple, really. It's a very common species that spreads by a creeping subterranean rhizome, so it's patch forming, that's its growth form. And in terms of how divided each frond is 3 times pinnate. So it's divided not once, not twice, but 3 times into those little subdivisions called pinnulets, if you all remember that. And this species, it's very common, and it's typically found on acid soils in woods, on heaths and moors, but not always, just typically. Very common plant is bracken. Here we have on the next family, the spleenwort family, one of the second largest family of ferns in Britain. We have 10 native species, all in one genus, which is the genus Asplenium. They're all relatively small plants, and they're all tufted as well. The fronds of most species in this genus in Britain, many are entire or once times pinnate, although some species can be up to 3 times pinnate and produce quite heavily divided fronds, like this black spleenwort at the bottom right here. Now, these plants in this family, they tend to be found in very rocky habitats, including on walls, between stonework, on weathered buildings, etc. And although we have 10 native species, we only have about 5 which are common and widespread. And so I'm going to go on to those now and how to identify them. So let's take a look at the first 2 very common species in the genus Asplenium. So first off, on the left, we have hart's tongue fern, which is a wonderful plant. It looks like a tongue that the fronds do. And this is the only species in the genus Asplenium to have entire fronds. So that's how you can differentiate it from all of the species in this family in Britain. Okay, the fronds are entire. And this is a species that typically inhabits walls, woods, rocky places. And as with all of the species that I'm going to go over, it typically likes base-rich alkaline sites, places that are rich in base ions like calcium. Okay, so on the right-hand side now, we're going to have a look at something called maidenhair spleenwort, Asplenium trichomanes. Now, by comparison, this is a species that has pinnate fronds. So it has those pinnae, which Asplenium scolopendrium, hart's tongue fern, does not have. The rachis or leaf stalk as well, with maidenhair spleenwort, is black and very, very thin. And again, as you can see by this hand in the picture, but for comparison, this is quite a small plant, as with all of the Asplenium species. And again, typically on walls in rocky places is where you'll find this, and weathered buildings. Okay. On to the last three species that I'd like to go over for the spleenwort family. So first off, on the left, we have black spleenwort, which is fairly common and widespread. Very similar habitat to hartstongue and maidenhair spleenwort. However, by comparison to both of those species, this is a species that has 2 to 3 times pinnate fronds. They can be quite divided. But also, the fronds are very triangular in shape. So I've put a little triangle to demonstrate that just on the picture at the top right, top left here. Petioles as well are quite blackish. By comparison, the rusty back fern is very, very different to all of the other Asplenium species we've gone over so far. This species is pinnate. And it gets its name from the dense covering of brown scales on the underside of the frond, so hence rusty back, which you can see from this picture here shared by Jamie Warren. It's a wonderful plant, again similar habitat to the other Asplenium species, although slightly less widespread and commoner in the south and west of the British Isles. Okay, and on to the last common and widespread species in the genus Asplenium. It's walrue at the top right. So these are very small plants, and in similarity with black spleenwort, the fronds are 2 to 3 times pinnate. However, unlike black spleenwort, fronds are more irregular and less triangular. The segments that the fronds divide into are quite fan-shaped, unlike black spleenwort. The petioles, unlike black spleenwort again, are green, and the fronds as a whole are quite thick. So that is the spleenwort family that we've gone over just now, the Aspleniaceae. Fantastic. On to the next family. Now this is the marsh fern family, which is one of my favourites again. I absolutely love them. And I can never pronounce the family name, Thalepteridaceae. Yes, okay. So within the marsh fern family, there are 2 common and widespread species, at least in the uplands of Britain. And those include the lemon-scented fern and the beech fern. They're both widespread and commonest in the uplands, so in the north and west of Britain. And one very characteristic thing about this family is that all of the species contained within this family have sori, the little reproductive bits that stick to the perimeter of the pinnules, these divisions of the leaf frond, which hopefully you can see quite well in this picture of a lemon-scented fern. So the sori, the reproductive bits, stick to the perimeter of the pinnules. Okay, so we've talked about lemon-scented fern and beech fern being contained within this family. Both species are widespread, particularly in the uplands. How do we tell them apart? Well, it's quite simple, really. The lemon-scented fern is a tufted plant that's sort of medium-sized to large, whereas the beech fern is a relatively smallish plant by comparison, and it's rhizomatous, it's patch-forming, so it's not tufted. Also, they're both 2 times pinnate. Also, with the beech fern, one very helpful identification character, I found it helpful anyway, is that the lowest pair of pinnae are angled away from the petiole, the leaf stalk, which I've demonstrated with these little red lines here. So the very lowest pair of pinnae are angled away from the leaf stalk, which is very characteristic with this species. With lemon-scented fern, now you can often confuse the lemon-scented fern with a couple of species that are contained within the genus Dryopteris, which we will go over momentarily. However, with the lemon-scented fern, it differs primarily from species contained within that genus by the position of the sori, which we can see here. So they are on the very margins of the pinnules. Species in the genus Dryopteris do not have that character. Also, lemon-scented fern, as its name would suggest, has a faint lemon scent, which is quite pleasant. So that is how you differentiate lemon-scented fern from the a few similar species in the genus Dryopteris. And that's how you differentiate lemon-scented fern from beech fern as well. Both wonderful plants. So let's have a look at the next family now, which is the lady fern family, which is a very convenient family because there's only one widespread species that's native in the UK, and that is lady fern, Ethereum filix femina. Now, with the lady fern, they are the sporophytes are tufted plants that are 2 to 3 times pinnate. One very characteristic thing about the lady fern are, again, the sori. So the reproductive bits, which we can see on the underside of the frond, pictured on the right here. So the sori on lady fern are hockey stick shaped, or many of the sori are L-shaped. So the way I remember it is quite simple, L for lady. And no similar species contain, for example, species in the genus Dryopteris, again, have those L-shaped sori, very distinctive. And this is a plant that's fairly widespread in Britain and fairly common. It's found in damp woods, rocky places. You often find it beside streams and places like that. Now, one thing I did want to clarify when I talk about lady fern is there are lady ferns and there are male ferns in Britain. One thing I want to clarify, that is just the common English name. It's not a female version of a male fern and vice versa. Lady fern is just the common English name for this species, Ethereum filix femina. So I just thought I'd say that for some clarity. Okay, so that's lady fern. Tufted plants, which have fronds that are 2 to 3 times pinnate, and they have those hockey stick shaped sori, which you can see in this picture on the right here. Very distinctive species. Now we'll next go on to another very convenient family, the hard fern family, Blecknaceae. Now I say this is convenient because, again, there's just one native species in Britain and Ireland which belongs to this family, and that is the hard fern, which I'd like to think is another very distinctive species that we get here. And I say it's very distinctive because it's one of few species that has differentiated fertile and sterile fronds, a little bit like the adder's tongues, I suppose. So essentially it produces these sterile fronds, which is labelled in this picture here, shared by David Steer. And these sterile fronds are quite linear and fattish. By comparison, the fertile frond is erect. It's more erect than the sterile fronds, and it almost looks like a fish skeleton. And so the fertile frond is what produces all the spores. And by comparison to the spleenworts, Hard fern is a plant that likes the opposite kind of habitat. So the spleenworts like rocky places on base-rich alkaline sites by and large, whereas the hard fern likes soils, acid soils on, and you'll often find it on peat as well. So quite the contrast between the spleenworts and the hard ferns in terms of habitat preference. Okay, so that's hard fern. We'll next be looking at a family that isn't so convenient, and this is the largest fern family that we get here in Britain, the Dryopteridaceae, the buckler fern family. Now it's the largest family in Britain, as I say, with 13 native species. All of the species contained in this family are tufted. That's their growth habit. And just to make things a little bit easier, a little bit more convenient, the Dryopteridaceae are split into two genera, including the Polystichums, the shield ferns, which is pictured on the left, and the Dryopteris ferns, the male and buckler ferns, on the right. And the key difference between both genera is this. The Polystichums, the shield ferns, have those pinnules which are on stalks. If you look where my mouse is hovering now, you'll see that the pinnules, those divisions of the frond, are on little stalks. That's very characteristic for species in this genus, Polystichum. By comparison, species in the genus Dryopteris, if you look where my mouse is hovering now, the pinnules are completely dedicated and attached to the frond. Then they don't have stalks. And so what I'm going to do now, there are 6 out of those 13 native species, there are 6 species contained within the genus Polystichum and Dryopteris that are common and widespread. So now we'll be looking at how to differentiate those 6 common and widespread species contained in this family. So first up is the Polystichums, the shield ferns with those stalked pinnules. There are 2 common and widespread Polystichum ferns in Britain, and they include the hard shield fern, Polystichum aculeatum, and the soft shield fern, Polystichum setiferum. Okay. And the difference between both of these species might not be obvious at first, but when you get your eye in, it's quite pronounced. So in hard shield fern, the fronds are very dark and glossy by and large. And the key identification feature with hard shield fern is, unlike soft shield fern, the very lowest pinnae, which I apologise, it isn't demonstrated too well on these pictures, but I couldn't find pictures that demonstrated it that well. So you'll have to take my word for it. But the lowest pinnae on hard shield fern are less than half as long as the pinnae you'll find in the middle of the frond. They're quite diddy, the very lowest pinnae. By comparison, the soft shield fern, which has paler fronds that tend to be more matte in colour, the lowest pinnae of soft shield fern are about as long as the middle pinnae, and so they are quite different. So those are the 2 Polystichums, the shield ferns that we get in Britain. Hopefully that makes identification of those things a little bit easier. Now let's look at the Dryopteris with those 4 remaining common and widespread species that we need to look at. So yes, there are 4 common and widespread species in the Dryopteris genus across Britain and Ireland. So how do we make identification of these 4 species that look superficially similar easier? Well, first off, we can look at how pinnate, how divided they are. With the male ferns, which are in the top row here, Dryopteris filix mass, male fern, and Dryopteris affinis, scaly male fern, both of these male ferns have fronds that are 2 times pinnate. By comparison, on the lowest row, we have the buckler ferns. We have broad buckler, Dryopteris dilatata, on the left, and we have narrow buckler fern, which is Dryopteris carthusiana, on the right. And the difference between these two species is that their fronds are 3 times pinnate, whereas the male ferns are 2 times pinnate. So let's start off by looking at the male ferns with those 2 times pinnate fronds. Okay. So we have both male fern on the right and scaly male fern on the left. And there is one very, very distinctive difference between both of these species, and that is this. On mature fronds of scaly male fern, if we have a look at the joint where the pinnae joins the leaf stalk, which I've circled in red all up this frond here, you'll have a very, very distinctive, obvious black blotch, which hopefully you can see where my mouse is hovering now. It's very, very distinctive. And sometimes what will happen on scaly male fern is the scales might cover up that colour. So you just need to yank the pinna off, and the black colour should be very obvious in scaly male fern. Now, by comparison, male fern, Dryopteris filix mass, does not have that colour, that black coloration at that joint where the pinnae join the leaf stalk. And again, sometimes you might get scales that cover up that joint, so just take the pinna off and inspect where the pinna joins the leaf stalk. So that's how you tell the difference between those 2 male ferns in the genus Dryopteris. They are tufted plants that are 2 times pinnate. They have these round sori, as do all Dryopteris species. And yes, so those are the 2 male ferns. Let's now have a look at those Dryopteris species that are 3 times pinnate, the buckler ferns. There are 2 common species in Britain, and those include the broad buckler, and they include the broad buckler fern, Dryopteris dilatata, on the left, and the narrow buckler fern, Dryopteris carthusiana, on the right. Now, there are subtle differences between both species, but I find the easiest difference between them are the scales, which you'll find on the leaf stalk or rachis, whatever you want to call it. In broad buckler fern, on the left, we've talked about scales when we were looking at those key identification features. And in broad buckler fern, the scales have a very, very dark centre and pale margins to the scales, which should be very obvious. By comparison, the scales of narrow buckler fern are concolorous, and they're straw-coloured, which we did talk about a little bit earlier on. And so that's how we differentiate both of those 3 times pinnate species. Okay. Now that was the largest family in Britain. We're now going to finish off with one last family, which is the Polypody family, the Polypodiaceae, which is a little bit simpler. In Britain, we have 3 widespread species, all in the genus Polypodium, like this southern Polypody here, pictured on the right. With all of the species, in this genus, the fronds are 1 times pinnate. Okay, and unlike the Dryopteris, the Dryopterids, these plants are not tufted, they are born from an extended rhizome. So that you'll find that these plants are trailing in habit. They have a rhizome that extends. Okay, so that's the growth habit for species in this genus. One thing that's quite distinctive about the polypodies is it might not be that well illustrated actually in this picture, but the pinnae tend to be fairly parallel sided, which you can see in some of these pinnae, particularly the lower ones on this front pictured on the right. And although you do get hybrids with some fern species, you tend to get a fair few hybrids, unfortunately, with the polypodies, particularly between common and intermediate polypody. And sometimes it can be very, very difficult to tell those apart. And so what I'm going to do now is differentiate between southern polypody, which is a very distinctive plant, and both common and intermediate polypody. And the reason I'm doing that is because common and intermediate polypody can be quite difficult to separate. The characters are fairly variable, and as I say, they can hybridize. And so unless you want to employ a microscope and get really involved in keys like Stace, I would suggest if you find a common or an intermediate polypody, potentially the best thing would be to record it to genus level, so Polypodium species. Okay. So southern polypody, Polypodium cambricum. As the name suggests, it's found mostly across the southern parts of Britain, South and West Britain, and it's usually often found on limestone. It's quite a fat fern, it's quite fatty, with the blade that is less than twice as long as it is wide. So if we look at this picture here, the widest point in the middle, these pinnae are really, really long, and so the fern looks quite broad in appearance. Okay. And one other feature with southern polypody, Polypodium cambricum, which hopefully you can see on this picture where my mouse is hovering, the pinnae, the apex to the pinnae are pointy, they're acute. By comparison, the common and intermediate polypodies are less restricted in their distribution. They're fairly widespread and common, and they can be found on either acidic or base-rich and alkaline rocks and substrates. You'll often find them as well growing on as epiphytes, so growing on trees. Usually with common polypody, you'll find that species prefers the more acidic soils, whereas intermediate polypody prefers the more base-rich alkaline soils. The pinnae, the apex to the pinnae can be various. In common polypody, you'll often find that the apex to the pinnae is rounded, but that's not always the case. Whereas intermediate polypody usually has an acute apex to those pinnae, but again, that's not always the case. And so if you don't have Polypodium cambricum, but you do have a polypody, what I would suggest is, if you're very new to fern identification, what would be best is that you just record it as Polypody sp or Polypody species. Because they can be quite difficult to differentiate. Okay, so those are all of the main fern families. Well done if you've grinned and bared it the whole way through this course. Now I understand it might be a little bit to take in. I've gone through quite a few things today, and so what I've done is I've established a closed group on Facebook called Fern Identification Course, and what I've done is I've uploaded this PowerPoint. And so what I'd suggest everyone do, if you want to recap on some of the stuff we've covered today, go on, add yourself to the Fern Identification course, ask to join the group, I'll approve you, and then you'll be able to access all of the learning material today, this PowerPoint. If you don't have Facebook, I've put my email down just here, so I'll give you about 15 seconds to jot that down if you want to do that. If you drop me an email, I'm recording this training course, so I can either forward you the PowerPoint or the recording or both of those things, fingers crossed. So yeah, either join the Fern identification course closed group or send me an email. Okay. And just before I go on to questions, what I want to thank everyone for massively is for giving me some money. So I charge £7 per entry for this course. Zoom actually take a 50p admin fee per person, which has meant that we have raised collectively over £650, which is all going to go towards the BSBI. Now, I don't work for the BSBI, I just love them. They're a fantastic organisation that help so many people get into plants. They produce so much learning material, and they also have a group of experts or referees that are able to provide assistance and advice when it comes to particular plant groups, including ferns. And so what I would encourage everyone to do, if you haven't already, is join the BSBI. There are so many benefits to being a member. You get so much learning material, including a scientific paper once yearly, as well as things like BSBI news. You also get access to referees. Now, I think it's about £30 per person, unless you're a student. So yes, that's what I'd encourage everyone to do just before I go on to questions. So yes, thank you very much for your very generous entry fee of £7. We've raised quite a bit for the BSBI. So yeah, thank you. Okay, questions. Let's go on to questions. Now, there are 100 odd people here today. So I may not be able to answer all of your questions, but if you'd like to either write in the chat, or there's a Q&A panel, I believe, which I'll just get on to if I can. I'll hopefully be able to answer some of your questions. Boom, boom, boom. Are no ferns red listed in Scotland, Wales and Ireland? Yes, indeed there are. Essentially, we have a few red lists. So in Britain, we have the IUCN red list, but what we also have are separate red lists for Wales, England, etc. And the BSBI produced, let me just get it. The BSBI have produced this little book, a vascular plant red list for England, which is fantastic and freely available online as well. And so this red list details red list species for England and Great Britain. So yes, there are red listed ferns in Scotland, Wales and Ireland as well. Will you be providing a download link for the presentation? Yep, I absolutely will. As I say, let's just go on to the slide. So if you've got Facebook, I would strongly encourage you just to join the closed group, Fern Identification Course, it's called. I will admit you and you'll be able to access the PowerPoint. What I'll try and do is just upload the video for this presentation onto that group as well. So yes. Do you have any advice on identifying different genera as a beginner before the sori are visible? That was from Lorraine. Sori isn't okay. The reproductive bits aren't always visible. It depends on the time of year, of course. And so it depends really. I found that with things like lady fern and male fern, differentiating those things, it's a case of just getting your eye in. I'd just encourage you to take a look at some perhaps photographic guides, illustrative guides. But essentially, with things like lady fern and differentiating that from other species, for example, it might just be a case of getting your eye in. Okay. Where's a good place to look for ferns? Generally wet places, woodlands that are a bit damp, walls for Asplenium species. You might go to a sandstone woodland, a woodland on sandstone with rocky outcrops for things like hard fern. So it all depends, really. That's from Hilary. You mentioned the commonly occurring or more widespread species. However, are there commonly occurring introduced species apart from water fern, which can cloud the process of identification somewhat from Dan Foy? The answer to that is no. There are a number of introduced species which you'll often find planted or in gardens, but you won't tend to find introduced species very often at all, apart from that one invasive plant species that I've talked about, the water fern. So the answer to that is no. What are the legally protected ferns, and have you ever encountered them? I've only ever encountered one of the legally protected ferns, which is Killarney fern. So I actually saw the gametophyte of this fern in Cheshire. And that's the only legally protected fern I've ever seen. Oh gosh, I couldn't list all of them offhand, but there's like a bladder fern, and there's a few ferns. If you take a look on Schedule 8 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, or ask Google what the European protected fern species are, I'm sure you'll be able to find out. Okay. If you wanted to ID Polypodium vulgare and interjectum, what would you recommend? I'd recommend either the Fern Guide by the FSC or Stace. It isn't always simple to tell these species apart because, as I say, the characters can be quite variable dependent upon the individual, whether it's under stress, growing conditions, etc. And the fact that they hybridize makes things even more difficult. And so if you're a beginner, I'd recommend steering clear of those just for now. But if you did want to try and identify them, take a look in either the Fern ID Guide by the FSC or Stace, which is, of course, the best, most comprehensive guide that you're going to get. Okay. Okay, Finley, thank you very much. You pointed out that I labelled scaly male fern as Dryopteris affinis ag, which is short for aggregate. Now, recently, I believe there were 4 species contained within the scaly male fern aggregate. However, those species have all been downgraded now in Stace 4 to subspecies. And differentiation between those can be a little bit challenging, perhaps. And this is an introductory course, which is why I didn't want to cover those. Okay. How widespread is water fern? And where did it come from originally? Ooh, I believe it came from South America. I'm not sure about that. I'll have to check, Kevin. But in Britain, it's very, very widespread. From the south of England to Scotland, it's widespread, and it's increasing in it's increasing northwards with climatic change as well. Okay. Are there attempts to limit the spread of the invasive fern? I believe there are, yes. There are natural, I'll need to have a look again. It's too early in the morning for me on a Saturday to recall, but there are biological control measures, I believe, being implemented across parts of Britain when it comes to water fern. Katie. Okay, Amy Fawcett has asked, what do you mean by the pinnae being parallel-sided? Okay, well, essentially, if you think this, let's just say my finger is the leaf stalk, and oh gosh, that's not a good example. Essentially, the pinnae, when they're parallel-sided, it just means they're next to each other. If they aren't parallel-sided, and they would be like this, they wouldn't be immediately next to each other. And so with polypody species, you'll often find that the pinnae are next to each other like this on both sides. They're parallel-sided, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's take a look. I believe those are all of the questions. Oh gosh, okay, I've got some more in the chat. I'll just answer one or two more questions. Best description of pinnate that I've heard. Thank you, Wiley. Hopefully my description of how divided a frond is was understandable to people. Again, if you want to refresh, it will be on the Fern Identification course group. Use the Merriweather Guide, David Hill says. Okay. Okay, I think that's all of the questions. So what I'll do now is just thank everyone for attending. And again, thank you very much for giving me some money for this, putting this course together, all of which will be going to the BSBI. Now, I'm going to be gift aiding this money as well, which will substantially increase the amount that the BSBI gets. So thank you all very, very much for attending today, and I'll hopefully see you again on a different identification course, a different training course. So yes, thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a lovely day. Okay, I'm going to go now and end this chat. Thank you very much.